But if you talk to the American congressmen, they have no clue because, frankly, and I'll name names, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal gives them a distorted perspective on China.
Some of us are concerned that the Chinese leader seems to be postponing his retirement indefinitely. Would you mind just commenting on that fact, please?
And the American ambassador is telling me, no, it wasn't Xi Jinping. It was the United States' failure to accept that offer. So that is a fact, but that fact never gets reported. And I would say that if you talk to the average American, they genuinely believe that the Chinese Communist Party has locked up 1.4 billion people in a jail. That the Chinese people are being oppressed by this repressive Chinese Communist Party.
Quoting Lee Kuan Yew, he actually said that in this world we shall never bet against the United States. But it seems to many of the China's readers, Chinese observers, people are thinking that China has bet against the US, where it has came out with lots of narratives saying that the East is rising, but the West is like falling or declining. Is the narrative of East, a rising East and a declining West necessarily true from your perspective?
大家好，我是老吴。在分享今天的内容之前，我想花2分钟聊一聊上2期关于金克宇教授的节目。那2期节目观看的次数其实不多，但评论区的批评声却不少。有意思的是，批评的声音分成了完全对立的2派，一派说他是大外宣，另一派又说他是美国的传声筒。但2派的共同点都是认为他没有什么真才实学。我的看法可能不一样，我觉得金教授是当今学术界少有能真正贯通中西2种视角，并且非常务实、接地气的年轻经济学家。而那些非黑即白、极端观点，恰恰说明一个问题：其实哪怕我们对自己的要求能达到对金教授要求的1/10，我想我们看问题的角度可能都会很不一样。所以我觉得我的频道可能更适合2类朋友。一类是希望通过这里分享的多元观点不断提升自己认知的朋友，另一类是本身已有很强的思辨能力，来这里交流、印证和获取新知的朋友。我知道我说话口音很重，表达也不够流畅，但我的频道订阅数成长的其实非常快，而且最近有越来越多的朋友开始购买超级感谢或者默默的加会员来支持我，这说明大多数朋友是认同我这个频道的初衷的。我的初衷其实很简单，就是想在这个话语权基本被西方主流媒体掌控的世界，分享一些不一样的、更平衡的观点，帮助大家更接近世界的本来面貌。说实话，能把我看到的好东西分享出来，本身就带给我很大的满足感。大家的订阅和观看已经远远超出了我的预期，而会员和打赏更是极大的满足了我的虚荣心。在这里真的非常感谢大家，谢谢大家。说到平衡通透的观点，今天这期节目里边的主讲人马凯硕先生就是一位真正的大师。今天和大家分享的是2020年9月马凯硕在香港外国记者会的一段问答，这部分内容可以说是整场活动最精彩的部分，充满了智慧的交锋和犀利的观点。好，接下来我们就进入这场精彩的问答。
Thank you, Professor Mahbubani. I'm going to jump straight into it. No doubt we are living in consequential times, as you so skillfully laid out just then in a very short amount of time. I've also heard you talk an even bigger game than that, Professor. A few weeks ago, you said in public remarks that, quote, the next 10 years will possibly be the most exciting 10 years since human history began in the field of geopolitics. Just the last century in human history, we saw the Second World War, the fall of the Soviet Union, to name just a couple. Why do you think the next 10 years will be so pivotal? And how do you see that next decade playing out when it comes to the US-China relationship?
Well, I mean, the reason why I think the next 10 years will be so pivotal is because, number one, the contest between US and China is already baked in. The forces that are driving it are structurally already created. And at the same time, the size and scale of the powers today of United States and China far exceed those of any other great powers of the past. I mean, the Soviet Union never came anywhere close to overtaking the United States in the size of its economy. And if you go back to World War II, the strength of Great Britain or Germany in those days cannot compare with the strength that the United States and China have in terms of the size and scale of their economies. And therefore, we have never seen two powers of the size of the United States and China in human history going to battle directly with each other. And that's why the next 10 years will be incredibly exciting. And that's why I'm trying my best to stay alive for the next 10 years.
Happy birthday as well. It's your
No, no.
75th year.
Yeah.
You alluded to it at the end of your remarks. How will the choice that American voters make in November affect those next 10 years? To what extent will that make a difference, the decision that voters make in the polls?
Well, I think the decision on the choice of a president is always consequential, always. And certainly history will flow differently depending on whether or not Trump is selected or Kamala Harris is selected. But one key point I need to emphasize is regardless of who's selected, the contest will continue. But how the contest is managed and be played out will be different. But the contest will continue. And you could have a discussion as to who will be better for China. In some ways probably Kamala Harris may be better for China because she'll be more predictable. And I don't think she'll be as dangerous on Taiwan as Trump could be. As you know, Trump's former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, actually gave a speech saying that the US should recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Now that's a declaration of war, clearly. And it's amazing that he said so. So if he comes back, he could be very dangerous. But on the other hand, Trump, as you know, could alienate so many countries in the world that people will be rushing to China for comfort. So, it's hard to say who will be better or worse for China.
What we can say for sure is the next decade will be consequential, to say the least. A few days ago, you were speaking at an event hosted by the Hong Kong Chinese.
You seem to follow my speeches.
My research professor. And a few days ago, you've been in Hong Kong for over a week, I believe. You spoke at the Hong Kong Chinese Importers and Exporters Association. Today, to our audience, you spoke about strengths and weaknesses of China and the US. And in this speech, you spoke about three structural forces that are driving the turbulence in the US-China relationship. The first being what you describe as the ironclad rule, that the number one power will always want to stop the number two power, dethroning it. The third being the ideological battle. The second is, as you yourself admitted in the speech, somewhat politically incorrect. The second structural force you mentioned, and please forgive me, I'm quoting directly, is, quote, the fear of the yellow peril. End
You
quote.
said it.
I did, which you said has deep historical roots, is very real, and affects how US policy is formulated. Can you expand a little bit on that? Are you saying that US policy is formulated based partly on ethnocentricity at best or xenophobia at worst? What were the nature of your comments?
Yeah, you're right. This is actually a very politically incorrect subject that will get both you and me into trouble, especially if we were in an American campus discussing the fear of the yellow peril. But I do believe that if you're a sort of objective social scientist, you have to acknowledge that the yellow peril exists. It's been buried there in the Western imagination since the Mongols almost conquered Europe about 800 years ago. And it's, as you know, it's surfaced in Western literature and Fu Manchu and other characterizations. I can tell you something you should all go and do some research on. I lived in New York in the 1980s as ambassador to the UN. At that time, the yellow peril wasn't China, it was Japan. And I remember reading a novel about the Japanese. It stunned me. It described the Japanese people as these cruel, evil, yellow people who were trying to undermine the white race. I mean, that's actually, I read the novel. But if anybody has any doubts that the yellow peril exists in the American imagination, please remember that the United States Congress passed a piece of legislation called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. Chinese Racial Exclusion Act in the 1890s. Now, if that's not a fear of the yellow peril, I don't know what is, And I emphasize that dimension because I'm trying very hard to persuade the United States and China to behave rationally towards each other. But if you are driven by an emotional fear, which is deep and dark, then frankly, you may do things that are crazy. And that's why I want to surface this emotional dimension. I want it to be understood, dissected, and analyzed so we can say, are you seriously being influenced by your emotion or your reason in this contest against China?
You mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, which obviously was in the late 19th century. Obviously, a lot of societal progress has happened in the US and around the world since then. The Chinese Exclusion Act was 30 years before universal suffrage in the US, before women were given the right to vote. And a part of America's ongoing social progress is it may be about to elect its first South Asian president. How would that change this interpretation of and this force that you think you're postulating is at play in US foreign policy conversations?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, the United States is an amazing society. I think before Kamala Harris, the fact that Barack Obama was elected was a tremendous source of inspiration to people all around the world. I remember I felt very excited and inspired when the United States elected a first black African American president, Barack Obama. So United States has the capacity to do that. But at the same time, as you know, there are many reasons why Donald Trump was elected in 2016. But one reason is that there wasn't a backlash, but there was a white lash. And there was feeling among the white population that we've had enough of the minorities running United States. It's time to go back to a strong white person. So there are always in any society conflicting strains. And one of the clear strains is the fear of the white population of losing its power within the United States. And that also results in antipathy towards people of other races. And I think this is something, now what I'm saying, by the way, is factual. Please go and check and research this. Attacks on people who look Chinese on the streets has increased. There's data to show that. That reflects what I call yellow pedal.
Indeed, the Stop Asian Hate campaign a couple of years ago was as a result of this increase. Moving on, I'm sure that the audience may come back to this point in the Q&A part. Moving on, the US-China bilateral relationship is often depicted as a game of winners and losers, the victor and the defeated, with some commentators sometimes coming across more as sports pundits, picking the runners and the riders, the winners in the big game. Is it a zero-sum game, or is there still a path to a win-win situation in this relationship?
Well, I firmly believe that there's a path towards a win-win solution, which is why I conclude my book, Has China Won, in the concluding chapter with what I call the 5 non-contradictions between the United States and China. And frankly, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that United States can grow and thrive and succeed, and China can rise and grow and thrive and succeed without necessarily having to bring each other down, And the one of the problems here, which is of course a very large issue, geopolitics is still driven by concepts and metaphors that come from 19th century battlefields where it was all a zero-sum game, especially within the powers in Europe. But we are no longer in the 19th century, we're in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, if you're a reasonably educated human being, you have to realize that the priority number one for the human race is to save planet Earth, because if planet Earth goes, that goes to human race. We don't have planet B to go to. So if we were rational, intelligent human beings, we should all be coming together, including US and China, to first save planet Earth. But what's amazing is that we actually may end up in a situation where the United States may re-elect a man, Donald Trump, who actually doesn't even believe in climate change, which is shocking, right? So the fact that the world's most educated society can elect a complete ignoramus on the greatest threat facing humanity is a sign that the world is in trouble.
You've spoken quite a bit over this last week that you've been in Hong Kong on a number of different subjects. So I want to, as we're speaking at the Foreign Correspondents Club, ask you a couple of questions that relate to the media. In your writings and public remarks, you have often made the claim that what you call the Anglo-Saxon media has a distorted perspective of reality. You are speaking in the right room to air those grievances today. What is the nature of your criticism of Western media, particularly in its coverage of China?
Well, I think I would be fair to say that the Anglo-Saxon media provides a distorted perspective of China. And I would say that if you talk to the average American, they genuinely believe that the Chinese Communist Party has locked up 1.4 billion people in a jail, that the Chinese people are being oppressed by this repressive Chinese Communist Party. And most Americans are not aware that in the year 2019, before COVID came, 139 million Chinese traveled freely out of China, and 139 million Chinese returned back to the gulags of China. There's something wrong with these Chinese people. They voluntarily return to gulags, So, the impression that Chinese society is a gulag is created by the Anglo-Saxon media, which only gives a negative coverage of what's happening in China and doesn't describe all the positive developments. And, the Chinese people have experienced greater improvements in their standard of living in the past 30, 40 years than they have in the past 3,000 to 4,000 years. So the sense of pride that the Chinese feel in what they have accomplished is absolutely amazing. But if you talk to the American congressmen, they have no clue because, frankly, and I'll name names, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal gives them a distorted perspective on China.
I'll move on to my second question and look forward to questions from the floor shortly to follow up on that point. The other question I have that pertains to misinformation in general. On issues such as the South China Sea, you've said in the past that the Western narrative and the Asian narrative now can't even agree on the same facts. Yesterday's small flare-up with the Chinese naval vessel colliding with a Philippine ship is an example of exactly what you were talking about. This also speaks to a wider trend in public life of not being able to agree on facts, right? The rise of advocacy media, social media echo chambers, disinformation campaigns, and some politicians' willingness to exploit these media ecosystems with what Kellyanne Conway notably termed as alternative facts. We seem to live in an age where people feel entitled to not only their own opinions, but also their own facts. You have been in public life for 5 decades. How have you seen the rise of the partisan press and social media change diplomacy and the nature of diplomacy over the decades?
Well, definitely in the age of social media, you're definitely getting much more untruths circulating more widely, and it's going to be a big problem for all of us. The search for truth is going to become harder and harder. That's a reality. But there are 2 dimensions of the problem. One is social media, which is unregulated, which is the problem. But I would say in quite often even the regular, in my view, the Anglo-Saxon media can give a misleading story. And I give you one example. That's a story that now everybody in the Anglo-Saxon media believes is that Xi Jinping offered to Barack Obama to demilitarize the South China Sea, since you refer to the South China Sea. And after Xi Jinping made the offer, Xi Jinping violated his promise and militarized the South China Sea. Every Anglo-Saxon media says that. None of them report what I said in my book, Has China Won? I had lunch with the former American ambassador to China, Stapleton Roy. I have his permission to cite him and know him. Stapleton Roy said that when Xi Jinping made that offer to Barack Obama should have shaken his hand and said, let's do it. Let's demilitarize the South China Sea. But instead, there was no acceptance of that offer, and the United States stepped up its naval patrols in the South China Sea, rejecting Xi Jinping's offer. So who violated that promise? Was it Xi Jinping? Was it the United States? And the American ambassador is telling me, no, it wasn't Xi Jinping. It was the United States' failure to accept that offer. So that is a fact, but that fact never gets reported.
talk about some of the structural issues in your comments a few days ago. One of them we just covered, the other being the ironclad law that number one will want to try to stop number two, and the third was ideological. Do you believe yourself in the intrinsic value of democracy?
Yes, I think, frankly, there will be a long-run evolution towards, different kinds of ways of managing one's societies. And I think at the end of the day, most countries will pick in one way or another democratic systems, because as you educate your population, the population wants to have a greater say in running the government, and therefore you'll move towards democracy. But what you will not get is not necessarily a convergence to the Western liberal democracies, because Western liberal democracies today are in serious trouble. This is something that's also not widely accepted here. I'm glad that Martin Wolf of the Financial Times has come out with a book called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. Look at his book, even the first chapter, and he'll point out to serious structural flaws that have developed in democracy. So when the West goes through its worship of democracy, it is actually doing democracy a lot of damage, because democracy is a very difficult political system to manage. And the warnings of why it's difficult to manage was given to us over 2,000 years ago by Plato. He warned us of populists. We didn't listen to his advice, and Donald Trump came back.
To misquote Winston Churchill, democracy being the worst form of government apart from all the other ones.
That's right.
Professor, I'm going to ask one final question before I open it up to the floor. Today's talk hasn't been about you, but you have recently published your memoir, which you were kind enough to sign some copies of before the talk, Living the Asian Century, an Undiplomatic Memoir, the writing of which no doubt entailed a lot of looking back and personal reflection. In retrospect, looking back at your career thus far, what do you think is the most important lesson that you have learned in your 50 years of public life that relates to what we've been speaking about today?
Well, I mean, the big lesson I learned about geopolitics is that it's a very cold, calculating, dangerous business. And in much of the discussions on geopolitics tends to be very naive. And the belief that countries are doing X or Y because they believe in certain principles or values. Principles and values I discovered after 2 years in the UN Security Council are irrelevant. Countries are driven by cold, hard interests. And that's the primary thing. And if we drop our illusions about geopolitics, then you realize you will manage geopolitics in a much better way. And I can say in my book, what I try to do is pay tribute to the three founding fathers of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, because they were amazingly brilliant. I speak as someone who has shaken hands of many world leaders. I mean, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski. I know the quality of mind of these leaders, but the quality of mind of the founding generation of Singapore leaders was amazing. And I only realized that now on reflection. So one of the goals of my book is to make Singaporeans aware that you have no idea how lucky you were to have these leaders.
We have about 10 minutes. Professor Mahbubani has a hard stop at 1:30 for another engagement. A microphone will be going around. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Do identify yourself before asking your question, and please keep your question to one question. The gentleman over there.
Hi, thank you, Prof. Mahbubani. Very fortunate one. I'm a Singaporean working for SENP, not a Western, not a few big names that you mentioned. Quoting Lee Kuan Yew, I still remember in 2013, when I was still serving Singapore media, he actually said that in this world we shall never bet against the United States, because that's where the innovations, technologies are coming from. And you have the great, like what you said, the greatest group of entrepreneurs who can come out with the most brilliant stuff. But it seems to many of the China's readers, Chinese observers, people are thinking that China has bet against the US, where it has came out with lots of narratives saying that the East is rising, but the West is like falling or declining. Is the narrative of East, a rising East and a declining West necessarily true from your perspective? And what can this world do to avoid the kind of this economy of scale where the best company the best country which is supposed to do manufacturing very well, that's China, and the American who innovates very well. But now it seems that the world is going back to each other where China is driving lots of money to do innovation and US is trying to pile a lot of dollars into manufacturing. So is there a path going forward that these two can continue or come back to look at their synergies that's potentially huge and beneficial? Thank you.
Okay, very, very quickly, we don't have much time.
Thank you for keeping it quick, William. Appreciate it.
I think there are two big points in your question. One is about, in a sense, the strength of the West, and two, whether or not there can be synergies within US and China. Now, I want to emphasize that the West will remain the single strongest civilization on planet Earth for several more decades. I mean, the West is not going to die and collapse in any sort of way. But the difference is that, I remember 100 years ago, in 1924, 100,000 Englishmen could effortlessly rule over 300 million ancestors of mine in India, which is remarkable. 100,000 Englishmen running 300 million Indians. Now, can you imagine that happening today? Impossible, right? Which is why I said in my recent Financial Times piece, it's time for UK to give up its Security Council seat and give it to India, which is now a much more powerful country than UK, which is a sensible thing to do, which I guarantee you the British will not do. But that's an example of the power shifts that have to occur. The relative power of the West is going to decline significantly, and the best way for the West to manage the decline is to intelligently share its positions in global governance institutions with the rest of the world. Now, the question of synergies is easier to answer. I do believe there are tremendous synergies that can exist between the United States and China, and that's the conclusion of my book, Has China Won? It's time for the US and China to come together, first of all, to save planet Earth, right, because of climate change, and then also work together to improve the conditions of the rest of humanity. Because if they work together, they can achieve a lot more. And frankly, it doesn't matter whether the United States has the largest economy or the second largest economy. If the American people are thriving and doing well, that's the most important thing.
Okay, the gentleman just there. I'll come over here in a moment.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kishore. I'm Brian. I'm an assistant professor at HKU. When Secretary of State Mike Pompeo took office, he told the State Department officials to have swagger when they talk to the outside world. In the past few years, maybe not so recently, but certainly the past couple of years, have seen a more trenchant approach and stance adopted by Chinese diplomats in reaction to domestic pressures, but also the audience from within the wall, so to speak. So my question is, at times when formal diplomacy seems to be struggling, what role do you see citizens, academics, and ordinary folks like ourselves, journalists and writers, what can we do to mend frayed relations? Is there agency on our part, or must we nevertheless accept that despite our best efforts, the state prevails, and we must humbly accept the fate of being the subjects of a bipolar world with governments calling the shots and not ourselves? Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Great question. I wish I could give you good news that the people of the world matter. Unfortunately, the one trend I've seen, there was a time, maybe post-Cold War, when you had the impression, especially after Francis Fukuyama's essay, that civil society, NGOs and all could make a difference. But there has been a tremendous power shift away from civil society towards governments, and certainly at a time of great contestation, I can tell you that even in the United States, is by the way the most freest, most democratic society on planet Earth. You can say anything you want in the United States, okay? Even in that society, people who want to say something rational or reasonable on China get punished. So they self-censor their remarks on China. So if you can have self-censorship on a big scale in the United States of America, when it comes to dealing with China or other issues, including Gaza and others, then it's a different world. And therefore, the role of governments is going to become more important. And therefore, it's much more important to persuade governments of what is the right thing to do.
We have time for one more question, two if we're quick. Back there, next to the wall.
Thank you. Some of us are concerned that the Chinese leader seems to be postponing his retirement indefinitely. Would you mind just commenting on that fact, please?
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of East Asia, the countries that have successfully transformed themselves from what I call third world economy to first world economy have always had leaders who stayed in office for quite long. South Korea, Park Chung-hee. If you look at territory like Taiwan, Chiang Ching-kuo. And certainly if you look at Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. So there's a certain phases in the development of societies where having continuity of strong leadership makes a big difference. And by the way, in the British parliamentary system, you can stay on as a leader for 30 years if you win the elections and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, length in office is not what matters. It's what you do with that length in office, whether or not you transform your society and leave behind something that is positive. And I'll give you another example. And this obviously you can see is a much more controversial example. One of the great mysteries to me is how Indonesia has emerged as the world's most successful Islamic democracy in the world. I mean, it's quite remarkable. They've had 3 peaceful transitions now, SBY, Jokowi to Prabowo. What happened? And the remarkable part of the answer is because they had a dictator like Suharto for so long, who actually improved the economic situation of the people at the bottom, raised their standard of living significantly, which then developed the middle class, which then developed the democracy that you see. So having leaders in office over a long time, if they do the wrong thing, if they do the right thing, can have a positive effect on the countries.
Thank you. Let's squeeze in one final question. There's the hand up. Let's do the gentleman back there.
Philip Bowring, journalist. You present a very bipolar view of the world, US against China. But both of those countries are, in fact, in relative decline against quite a number of other countries, notably India, and including, in fact, as you just mentioned, Indonesia. So is your view not far too simplistic and takes no account, in particular, of India, which now has the largest population, and certainly, although far behind China at the moment in industrial capability, has ability to catch up, just as China caught up in the years between 1990 and 2010. So how do you see India's role in this bipolar world that you otherwise present?
Well, I'm happy to inform you I agree with you. I mean, given the shortage of time, you have to simplify things. But I can assure you that I guarantee you that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we are clearly moving to a multipolar world. And in that multipolar world, India will be the third most independent pole. Right now, by the way, just so that you understand the relativities, if the United States is about 24 trillion and China is 17, 18 trillion, India is still 3.6, 3.8 trillion. So India is still way behind. India will catch up, and certainly by 2050, India will be number 2 or number 3 in the world, clearly in the same league. But that will take some time. Over the next 10 years, India will not be participating as much as a third pole because it's still way behind. But over time, and we are moving to a multipolar world. And I also want to emphasize that many countries in the global south, including countries like, say, Brazil or South Africa and the BRICS countries, are going to step up and play a bigger role on the world. And if you want to understand the world that is coming, I describe it in 3 M words. Okay, so it's going to be a 3 M world. It'll be multi-civilizational. There'll be many successful civilizations. It'll be multipolar. There'll be many powers. And you notice, for example, like even in the Ukraine war, it's striking that 85% of the world's population has not imposed sanctions on Russia. That's a very incredible statistic that shows that this global south is making its own decisions. And the third M is multilateral. And what we have to do actually is strengthen multilateral institutions if we're going to take care of our common global problems. So I agree with you, it'll be a very complicated world coming. But over the next 10 years, I would focus on US, China, and then get ready for a different world.